Now, we all know the tragedy that was Salem witch trials, and we know that many innocent people were condemned by those that were driven by greed and power, but also from a very real fear of the unseen world. Today, we hear and learn from this historical event, but very little is mentioned of the actual witchcraft that took place in those days. Much like the covens today, no one, regardless of their beliefs, should be persecuted and never put to death, but I found it weird. Not many people mention that. Yes, witches did exist in those times and throughout history. Vampires, werewolves, ghosts, and demons, all these topics have been written about and researched for years. But in these times, we no longer fear the unseen world, right? Most of us believe we have a firm grip on what we believe to be reality. But just because you don't believe in something doesn't mean it can't exist. So grab those wooden stakes, crosses, and garlic, because tonight we head into the shadows and we pull the coffin lid back on the topic of vampires in America.
We're going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west.
Stop this. A UFO.
Vampires have captivated American culture for centuries, from Bram Stoker's iconic Dracula to modern portrayals in TV shows and movies. But behind the fictional tales of bloodthirsty creatures lies a darker, more sinister reality. What if I told you that there's more to the vampire legend than just myths and folklore? The problem, though, with vampire lore is that it's often shrouded in mystery, making it difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction. We have all heard the stories of blood-sucking creatures roaming the night, but how much of it's based on reality? The truth is, many of these tales have been passed down through generations, often getting distorted or exaggerated along the way. This lack of clarity has led to a proliferation of misinformation, making it challenging to separate myth from reality. In many cases, these misconceptions can be harmless, but when it comes to something as complex as vampire folklore, the lines between fact and fiction can become increasingly blurred. As a result, it's essential to approach these stories with a critical eye, sifting through the fiction to uncover the hidden truths. One of the most significant challenges is the vampire legends often stem from oral traditions passed down through word of mouth. This means that the stories can change and evolve over time, making it difficult to pinpoint their origins. Additionally, the lack of concrete evidence has led many to dismiss the vampire tales as fantasy. However, what if I told you that there are some historical accounts that suggest otherwise? The distinction between myth and reality becomes even more complex when you consider the cultural significance of vampires in America. From literature to film, vampires have captivated our imagination, often reflecting our deepest fears and desires. But what if these stories were more than just mere entertainment? What if they were actually based on real events, or at least inspired by them? Since I was a kid and learned that one of my grandparents was accused of being a witch during the Salem witch trial days, I've been fascinated with all the epic, crazy, and weird history around the world, especially here at home in the United States. Although my great-great-great-great-great-grandma was accused of being a witch, because as the court document stated, a woman was kicked in the head by a cow immediately after having a dream of my grandmother floating above her, kicking her in the head. True story, guys. That was enough, apparently, to bring my grandma in and lock her up. Just thank God my grandpa fought for the king's army at the time, and he was also a wealthy landowner. So after giving away a huge portion of the family farm and several letters to higher-ups and several pounds, Grandma was released and free to return home with her name cleared. Not everyone was so lucky. We know those stories all too well. But it doesn't stop there. The New England vampire panic of the 19th century. 200 years after the Salem witch trials, farmers became convinced that their relatives were returning from the grave to feed on the living. Griswold, Connecticut, 1990. Two children playing near a hillside gravel mine stumbled across the first graves. The boy ran home to tell his mom, who was skeptical at first. But when the boy produced a skull, that turned her mind. Because this was Connecticut in 1990, police initially thought the burials might be the work of a local serial killer at the time named Michael Ross, and they taped off the area as a crime scene. But the brown, decaying bones turned out to be more than a century old. The Connecticut state archaeologist Nick Bellantoni soon determined that the hillside contained a colonial era farm cemetery. New England's full of such unmarked family plots, and the 29 burials were typical of the 1700s and early 1800s. The dead, many of them children, were laid to rest in thrifty Yankee style, in simple wood coffins, without jewelry or even much clothing, their arms resting by their sides or crossed over their chest. Bellantoni was interested in one grave particularly, even before the excavation began. It was one of only two stone crypts in the cemetery. Scraping away soil with flat-edged shovels and then brushes and bamboo picks, the archaeologist and his team worked through several feet of earth before reaching the top of the crypt. When Bellantoni lifted the first of the large flat rocks that formed the roof, he uncovered the remains of a red-painted coffin with the initials JB on the lid. And inside was a pair of skeletal feet. They laid in perfect anatomical position, but when he raised the next stone, Bellantoni saw the rest of the individual had been completely rearranged. The skeleton had been beheaded. Skull and thigh bones rested atop the ribs and vertebrae. It looked like a skull and crossbones motif. A Jolly Roger. He had never seen anything like it. Subsequent analysis showed that the beheading, along with other injuries, including rib fractures, occurred roughly 5 years after death. Somebody had also smashed the coffin. The other skeletons in the gravel hillside were packaged for reburial, but not JB, as the 50-ish male skeleton from the 1830s came to be called because of the initials spelled out in brass tacks on his coffin lid. He was shipped to the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. for further study. Meanwhile, Bellantoni started networking. He invited archaeologists from all over to come and survey the excavation site. Simple vandalism seemed unlikely, as did robbery because the lack of valuables at the site. Finally, one colleague asked, "Ever heard of the Jewett City vampires?" Bellantoni was stunned. He thought back, and he remembered in 1854, in a neighboring Jewett City, Connecticut, townspeople had exhumed several corpses suspected to be vampires that were rising from their graves to kill the living. A few newspaper accounts of these events survive to this day. Had the Griswold grave been desecrated for the same reason? In the course of his far-flung research, Bellantoni placed a serendipitous phone call to Michael Bell, a Rhode Island folklorist who had devoted much of his previous decades to studying the New England vampire exhumations. The Griswold case occurred at roughly the same time as the other incidents Bell had investigated, and the setting was right. Griswold was rural and bordering the southern Rhode Island, where multiple exhumations had occurred. Many of the other vampires, like JB, had been disinterred, grotesquely tampered with, and then reburied. In light of the tales Bell told of violated corpses, even the rib fractures began to make sense. JB's accusers had likely rummaged around in his chest cavity, hoping to remove and perhaps to burn his heart. Rhode Island folklorist Michael Bell has documented 80 vampire exhumations. He believed that hundreds more cases await discovery, reaching as far back as the late 1700s and as far west as Minnesota. But most are concentrated in the backwoods of New England. In the 1800s, later than the obvious Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, almost 2 decades after JB's grave was discovered, it remains the only intact archaeological clue to the fear that swept the region. Most of the graves are lost to time, and even in the cases where they aren't, unnecessary exhumations are frowned upon by the locals. Though scholars today still struggle to explain the vampire panics, a key detail unites them. The public hysteria almost invariably occurred in the midst of the savage tuberculosis outbreaks. Indeed, the medical museum test ultimately revealed that JB had suffered from tuberculosis or a lung disease very much like it. Typically, a rural family contracted the wasting illness, and even though they often received the standard medical diagnosis, the survivors blamed early victims as vampires, responsible for preying upon family members who subsequently fell sick. Often an exhumation was called for to stop the vampire's appetite for blood. The particulars of the vampire exhumations, though, vary widely. In many cases, only families and neighbors participated, but sometimes town fathers voted on the matter, or medical doctors and clergymen gave their blessing, or even pitched in. Some communities in Maine and Plymouth, Massachusetts, opted to simply flip the exhumed vampire face down in the coffin and leave it at that. In Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont, they frequently burned the dead, cremating their hearts, sometimes inhaling the smoke as a cure. In Europe, two exhumation protocols varied with region. Some beheaded suspected vampire corpses, while others bound their feet with thorns. Often these rituals were lantern-lit affairs, but particularly in Vermont, they could be quite public. Even festive. One vampire heart was reportedly torched on the Woodstock, Vermont town green in 1830. In Manchester, hundreds of people flocked to the 1793 heart burning ceremony at a blacksmith forge at the altar. It was known as the sacrifice to the demon vampire, who it was believed was still sucking the blood of the living. This was the case of a woman named Rachel Harris Burton of Manchester, Vermont. In the historical documentation in this case of vampirism, it states that Rachel, after falling ill, she died and was buried locally in 1792. Her husband would later remarry, and again, his now second wife would fall ill to a mysterious condition and pass away. It didn't take long for the locals to cast the blame on the corpse of Rachel. It was believed that her body must be rising from the grave in a jealous rage to claim the life of her widowed husband's new bride. Rachel had now become known as the demon vampire. Now, the vampires, as we think of them today, rising from the grave, the body crawling from its coffin, roaming the countryside until sun is up. That's not the way they believed it back then, at least not all of them. The term vampire was never used until the press posted a story using that reference. The good people of the village believed that these were demon spirits that attached themselves to the corpse and would rise from the body to feed on the living. This thinking would provide explanation for the graves never being disturbed and dirt never misplaced and the coffins fully intact. So in order to stop the demonic force from doing more harm to the community, the town fathers and local clergy assembled their team and would head into the darkness of night to the not so restful place of Rachel's grave. The scene would be described by a judge named John S. Pettibone. He stated in his 1860 book, Proceedings of the Vermont Historical Society, they took out the liver, heart, and lungs, at least what remained of them, and burned them to ashes on the blacksmith forge of Jacob Mead. He also officiated at the altar in the sacrifice to the demon vampire, who it is believed was still sucking the life of the then living wife of Captain Burton. It was the month of February, and good sleighing. Such was the excitement that from 500 to 1,000 people were present. Now, not all vampire exhumations were public. Many did not draw a crowd or newspaper coverage. Usually, the bigger towns with more cemeteries drew the crowds and coverage. Cases of vampires ran rampant throughout American countryside. Bodies have been found buried with many types of remedies, if you will, to keep the vampire in the grave. Now, some people must have thought more of vampire as a corpse crawling from the grave, and not just an evil spirit that could float from the body to do harm, because skeletons have been found with swords across their necks to prevent the body from getting out of the grave with its head intact, bones arranged in confusing ways to throw off the body returning from the grave, and of course corpse mouths have been found pried open so they can't bite. Some bodies were found buried at the crossroads so the dead, when they came back, could not find their way back. Nestled behind a tiny white Baptist church in Chestnut Hill Cemetery in Rhode Island, you can find the final resting place of a young woman named Mercy Brown. Today, plastic vampire teeth and trinkets, beads, and other offerings can be found all over Mercy's tombstone. To the best of historical documented knowledge, this would be the last case of vampires in America, bringing an end to the New England vampire panic of the 19th century. The story goes like this. Edwin Brown was wasting away. For the better part of 2 years, he grew increasingly thin and weak as tuberculosis ravaged the once strapping young man. In March 1892, Edwin struggled to breathe as he continually coughed up blood. He had sought a cure in the rarefied air and mineral waters of Colorado Springs, Colorado. But the 18-month trip offered no healing powers and only left him homesick for a small town in America's tiniest state. Edwin Brown returned home to Exeter, Rhode Island, where his father tilled the soil as a Yankee farmer. George Brown had watched helplessly as the disease known as consumption took the lives of his wife, Mary Brown, in 1883, followed by his 20-year-old daughter, Mary Olive, 6 months later, while his only son grew weaker and weaker in the winter of 1892. Tuberculosis also took his 19-year-old daughter, Mercy Lena Brown, who passed away after a year of sickness on January 19, 1892. The disease that took 3 members of George Brown's family was the top killer of its time in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in New England. Tuberculosis passed easily between people in close quarters, which is why it tended to sweep through entire families such as Brown's. While the disease was all too common for the townspeople of Exeter, what happened next certainly wasn't. In 1892, tuberculosis was still poorly understood. It was widely known what caused this disease or how it spread. Doctors were unable to explain the wave of sickness washing over George Brown's family, but relatives and friends thought they knew the reason for this sickness, and it was buried 6 feet under. With medical science failing to help Edwin Brown, distraught Exeter residents turned to superstition and the supernatural. In a desperate attempt to save his life, a vampire hysteria gripped the New England town. A group of Exeter residents believed that Edwin's mother or one of his sisters may be undead, caught between heaven and hell, and sucking the life out of him from beyond the grave, which meant that the cure could rest with their bodies. With the extremely reluctant blessing of George Brown, who at first discounted the vampire theory, his relatives and neighbors visited the Brown family plot in the town's cemetery in Chestnut Hill on March 17, 1892. In the small graveyard behind the town's Baptist church, they exhumed the bodies of Mary Brown. With the extremely reluctant blessing of George Brown, who at first discounted the vampire theory, his relatives and neighbors visited the Brown family plot in the town's Chestnut Hill Cemetery on March 17, 1892. In the small graveyard behind the town's Baptist church, they exhumed the bodies of Mary Brown and Mary Olive Brown. They opened the caskets, and as you could imagine, they found only their bones inside. The townspeople then turned their attention to the casket of Mercy Brown, who had died 8 weeks earlier. Accounts differ as to whether Mercy's body had already been buried or if it was resting in a crypt until the ground could thaw and the undertakers could dig her a proper grave. However, when the lid was lifted off of Mercy's coffin, her body was found on its side. Her face appeared flush, and there was blood in her heart and her veins. Dr. Harold Metcalf, who had raised his objection to the entire affair, assured everyone that the lack of decomposition of Mercy's body was perfectly consistent with the fact that she had only been dead for less than 2 months. Knowing that medicine had done nothing to save the Browns, the people of Exeter ignored the doctor's proclamations and took the presence of fresh blood in Mercy's heart as a sign that she was undead. They gathered firewood and kindled a bonfire on a pile of nearby rocks. Then they cut out Mercy's heart and lungs and cremated them on the pyre. They returned to Edwin Brown's house with the ashes of his dead sister's heart and mixed them with water. Edwin consumed the concoction, but the tuberculosis continued, and he died 2 months later on May 2nd, 1892. This was not the first time the folk remedy of burning the organs of the dead and mixing the ashes into an elixir for the sick had been tried in Rhode Island, even in Exeter. In 1799, the townspeople exhumed the body of Sari Tillingshast, suspecting her of being a vampire. Author Diane Ross McCain reports there were 18 documented instances of the exhumation of family members in suspected vampire cases throughout New England in the 18th and 19th century. But the case of Mercy Brown would be the last documented case of vampires in America. After digging up Mercy Brown, the townspeople buried her heartless body into the ground of Chestnut Hill Cemetery, where under a weathered tombstone, she now rests in peace. So, as the leaves blow across the ground outside my window in this cool autumn night, I think about Mercy's story and Rachel's, all the cases of vampires in America. And I wonder what would drive people to perform such acts on corpses. The fear that had to grip them at that time had to be overwhelming. To see your family die a mysterious illness with no hope or no understanding had to be crushing to the whole community. But we have to ask ourselves, to what lengths will we go as humans when we're pushed by fear? What measures will we take when confronted with the unknown? Of course, like the Salem witch trials, we now believe we have proven the cause. With the witch trials, we blame poison spores in bread that caused hallucinations to plain old power and greed. And all signs point to the once mysterious disease of tuberculosis as the main reason for the good people of New England believing in vampires. Nowadays, things are different. The electric light brightens the night sky. Technology puts answers to any question we may have a Google search away. Medical science has driven most of the mystery from illness, and we now explore the stars, reaching for more and more answers to our place in the universe. With all the new knowledge we've gained over the years, is it possible we've lost something? Perhaps some of the old knowledge and belief of the spiritual kind. With our rush to discover and explore, have we pushed aside some of the ideas and beliefs in the unseen world? Some of the beliefs that our ancestors had that kept them humble, respectful, maybe aware of the possibility of powerful things that exist only in the shadows. I have seen enough in my life to know, without a doubt, there exist forces that we can't always see. Our science has yet to at least tell us that they can prove or disprove it. And it usually isn't discussed in a serious manner for fear of how others will perceive us. But make no mistake, the paranormal, these things do exist. And sometimes to understand the unknown, it takes a leap of faith. As the great Nikola Tesla said, the day science begins to study the non-physical phenomena, it will make more progress in one decade than in all the other previous centuries of its existence. On our journey for knowledge and understanding of our place in this restricted 3D existence of our perceived reality, let's be very, very careful we don't lose our souls along the way. Hey guys, special thanks to all you fine people out there that listen to tonight's show. Without you, there is no me. So thank you guys so much. Be sure to check out this episode and over 16 years of archives at your place for the strange, shadownation.com. Also, make sure you like and subscribe on the YouTube page. You can find that at www.youtube.com/@ShadowNationPodcast. Please give a like and subscribe, guys. It really helps. Make sure to follow along on all my social media, and you can't miss anything if you do. The upcoming episodes, contest, or exclusive content. Instagram's Shadow Nat Podcast. That's Shadow Nat Podcast. Facebook, Shadow Nation Show. And you can follow on Twitter at Shadow Nat Pod 1. Shadow Nat Pod 1. From the haunted back roads of America, this has been another episode of your Shadow Nation. Don't go changing America. You know I won't. Because I love you. Good night, everybody.